Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on December 10th, 2025. Imagine that a political party in your country has just taken a beating in the most recent election, falling to its lowest number of seats in decades. Predictably, the party's leader resigns, triggering a leadership contest. A candidate who has never run for political office then comes forward, and he has a bold agenda. The candidate is a well-known critic of militarism, the Anglo-American Empire, and the capitalist system. He's written many books on the subjects. In his books, he argues that your country, a NATO member, should withdraw from NATO, and in fact, NATO should be disbanded. He calls for a reduction in military spending and the reallocation of military spending to programs that improve the lives of ordinary citizens. He opposes the Western practice of using sanctions to destroy entire economies just because the leaders of these countries won't do Washington's bidding. He opposes regime change wars, and consistently so. The candidate says that Israel is a genocidal state, that your country should end all forms of support for Israel, that any of your citizens who serve in Israel's army should be prosecuted criminally, and that Israel's leaders should be arrested if they dare to set foot on your soil. The candidate also argues for the replacement of the capitalist system with an economic system that is much more humane and much more democratic. He says that we can and must eliminate homelessness and poverty, and that we should not, under any circumstances, allow a tiny number of people in our country to accumulate vast amounts of wealth. In fact, he goes so far as to say that we should tax billionaires right out of existence. Finally, the candidate puts forward an economic platform that prioritizes the interests of workers and the poor over the interests of the wealthy and large corporations. Now, if this happened in your country, would you think that that candidate should be allowed to run for the leadership of this party that is now in search of a new leader? Well, this week, the establishment of Canada's New Democratic Party blocked the leadership bid of just such a candidate. The candidate's name is Yves Engler, and we'll speak to Yves in a few minutes about what just transpired in the NDP leadership contest. But before we bring Yves into the conversation, I wanted to share with you some relevant background information. When Yves announced months ago that he would run to be the leader of the NDP, he knew that there was a high risk that the party brass would block his leadership bid, and he was not shy about talking of that risk. As a result, his campaign asked me to act as its lawyer if the party's vetting committee rejected Yves' application. I agreed to do so readily and on a pro bono basis. And there's basically two reasons why I took this responsibility on. First, I agree with Yves' critique of the Anglo-American Empire, militarism, and the capitalist system. Moreover, not one of the 343 members of Canada's Parliament is willing to take the positions that Yves has consistently taken for his entire adult life. Not one member of Canada's Parliament advocates for NATO to be disbanded or for Canada to withdraw from NATO. Not one member of Canada's Parliament condemns the use of sanctions by Western governments. Not one member of Canada's Parliament argues for a large reduction in military spending. And not one member of Canada's Parliament condemns the capitalist system and argues that we should replace it with an economic system that is much more humane and democratic. Not a single one. Sparks Insights recently conducted an online survey of nearly 3,000 adults and found that 43% of Canadians believe capitalism, quote, is doing more harm than good today, close quote. Also asked, quote, how do you feel about capitalism and socialism, close quote. 29% of respondents said socialism is a better approach, while 28% said capitalism works best. With numbers such as these, how can it be that anti-capitalists have zero representation in Canada's Parliament? Even if you like capitalism, even if you are an adoring fan of capitalism, then you should still want someone like Yves to be allowed to run if you support democracy. If democracy is your priority, then all significant constituencies in Canadian society, or whatever society you happen to live in, should have at least some representation in the national legislature. But that's not the case in Canada today. The reason that anti-capitalists have no representation in Canada's Parliament is that the system is rigged to prevent them from winning and even running. The corporate media love to portray the New Democratic Party as a left-wing party. Some in the corporate media go so far as to describe it as far left. But to those of us who are truly left-wing, this characterization of the NDP is downright laughable. A far more accurate description of the NDP would be centrist. Its domestic policies lean slightly to the left, and its foreign policies lean slightly to the right. And when you add them all up, what do you get? You get a centrist party. There is no true left-wing party in Canada's parliament, and there hasn't been one for a very long time. The corporate media describe the NDP as left-wing because they want you to believe that the left is represented in Canada's parliament and that Canada has a real democracy. But that, my friends, is bollocks. The second reason I agreed to represent Yves' campaign is that I myself was blocked from running for the leadership of a political party in Canada about 5 years ago. That party is the Green Party of Canada. In early 2020, after Elizabeth May, its leader of 13 years, resigned in the wake of a disappointing election, I threw my hat into the ring along with 7 other candidates, one of whom, by the way, was a former minister in the Ontario government. Now, initially, like Yves, I anticipated that an effort would be made to prevent me from running at all. And indeed, when I initially submitted my vetting application, it was rejected. But then I filed an appeal. And to its credit, I suppose, the Green Party not only personally interviewed me in the course of the appeal, something that the NDP did not do in the case of Yves Engler, but ultimately the review committee overturned the decision of the vetting committee to reject my candidacy. I went on to not only be a competitive candidate, but I came within a hair's breadth of winning because of a huge upswelling of support within the party for the type of program that I just described. It's a platform that bears a great many similarities to the platform on which Yves Engler chose to run. And at the end of the day, after a long and grinding leadership contest, I finished second out of 8 candidates with about 45% of the vote on the 8th and final ballot. The person who defeated me, who was heavily favored and openly supported by the former leader Elizabeth May, her name was Annie Paul, crashed and burned within about a year after a spokesperson she had appointed to not only be her spokesperson, but also to be her main advisor, began to viciously attack 2 members of the Green Party caucus, 2 sitting members of the Canadian Parliament from the Green Party, because they had dared to describe Israel as an apartheid state. Annie Paul ended up resigning about a year after she won the leadership contest and has barely been heard about since, except that she happened to resurface a couple of weeks ago in a photograph posted by an Israeli diplomat showing that she and numerous others from Canada known to be fanatical Zionists had met with leaders of Israel in the genocidal entity as the genocide is unfolding in Gaza. Now, it would not at all be a surprise to me if the NDP was so freaked out, I'm talking here about its party brass, not by the grassroots, by what happened in the 2020 GPC leadership race when I was ultimately allowed in. They decided they were going to keep Yves out of the race at any cost. Because once you let a candidate like Yves into an open and democratic contest, anything can happen, and he might just surprise you by taking the party by storm. In any case, having experienced this anti-democratic behavior myself, I thought I would be well placed to assist Yves if he too encountered resistance from the NDP establishment. So with all of this as background, let's bring Yves into the conversation. So Yves, before we get into what happened in the vetting process, can you tell us a little bit about how your campaign was performing up until the point in time at which your application was rejected? And for example, how much money had you raised? How many people donated to your campaign, and how many volunteers did you have?
Yeah, we've raised about $110,000. We have about 700, I don't know the exact number, 700 donors. Over 1,000 people have or volunteers in the campaign. I think we had the biggest event of any campaign in about, I guess about a month ago in Toronto. About 200 people showed up at a Friday night speaking event. And we've have a very comprehensive platform far beyond any of the other campaigns. And I've done maybe 20, 25 speaking events across the country. So there's clearly a significant amount of support. There's absolutely no possibility that we don't have more support than at least two of the candidates that are officially in the race, and possibly more than even some of the frontrunners.
And you were able to raise that money, about $110,000, I understand, without being in a position to offer tax receipts to your donors because you had not yet been approved as a candidate by the NDP. That means that they were not able to, they didn't have any assurance that they were going to be able to claim a tax credit on their contribution. Is that right?
Yeah, well, they had to agree that they couldn't get any tax credit. It was clear that even if we got through vetting, they still wouldn't get a tax credit, and that was stated up front. But it's more than that. So we're restricted by Elections Canada donation maximum. So no one can give more than $1,750. But we couldn't give the benefit, which is the tax credit that covers, at least for the first $500, most of your donation. But beyond that, we didn't have access to the NDP list. So all the other candidates, when they have their public events and they have their, talk about their fundraising and the different stuff they're doing, they have access to the NDP list, which I don't know the exact number, but 100,000, 150,000 emails, phone numbers, and the like, which obviously helps to fundraise and helps to get people out to your events. We've done all of our campaigning, all of our events, all of our fundraising with just our own organizing capacities. So there's no doubt that if we had access to the NDP list, we would have certainly raised 200,000, 250,000, who knows how much, and we would have had even bigger political events because we would have the current email list we have and the current capacity we have, as well as a whole other, a big contact list that has been the basis for a number of the other candidates. It's literally their basis. The only way they even got the nomination signatures, which we got in 4 days, 2.5, 3 months ago, the only way they got the requisite number of nomination signatures was because they had access to the list and the like.
Yeah, so we're talking here about a huge amount of money when you consider that the NDP, after the disastrous election it had earlier this year, has only 7 seats out of 343 seats in Canada's parliament. So it's, by any rational measure, quite a small party at this stage. And still, with all of these obstacles, you managed to raise that amount of money. So I think that is clearly a testimony to the level of support you managed to obtain even before being approved as a candidate. And just, could you tell us, so people understand, what was driving this support? Just in broad strokes, what does your platform say?
Well, the platform is capitalism can't be fixed, onwards to a socialist future. And we are offering a very clear alternative to this wealth concentrating ecocidal capitalism, and which includes comprehensive discussion about the imperialist nature of Canadian foreign policy, and also talks about the history and ongoing colonization and the need for land back for Indigenous peoples.
So with that as background, let's get into the reasons for your rejection. And with your consent, I'm going to show people in the audience what you were actually told by the original vetting committee, so people understand how this worked. Yves submitted his application. Then I believe a 3-member committee whose identities were not disclosed to you at any point, they made a decision to reject your application. And at that point, they provided you with a set of reasons in sort of summary form. So these are the first 2 reasons I'm putting up here on the screen. It's maybe a little bit too small for people to read, but I'll read them out for you in any event. The first one was credible evidence of harassment, intimidation, and physical confrontation. And they go on to say, we received credible evidence that you have repeatedly engaged in harassment, intimidation, and physical confrontation of elected officials, party members, staff, and volunteers. They say, since you announced your intention to run for the party leader, the party has received many letters of concern from members of the party and the public, in other words, people who aren't members of the party, indicating concerns with your candidacy and its incompatibility with the principles and core values of the party. Your reported conduct includes disruptively confronting elected officials in public and private spaces and interrupting meetings, events, and presentations to such an extent that individuals present felt unsafe and disinclined to return or participate in the party, and intimidating party members and staff, following people to their private accommodations and private vehicles while insisting they respond to your questioning, all of which made them feel unsafe. So, Yves, how do you briefly respond, and how did we respond in your appeal to this allegation?
Well, we respond by saying, "Can you give us details beyond generalities?" And they responded by not giving any details. I don't. It's hard to respond. I've heard a Canadian Press reporter just suggested that the NDP is actually going around to journalists right now and sort of giving this mud, sending this mud to different journalists to kind of smear me as their decision was based upon harassment and the like. I don't know how you respond to something when they're not willing to give you, if there's some allegation, they want to black out the name of someone saying that I supposedly did this at that time or this or that. Okay, fine. But if you don't give us any detail, I don't really know how you respond. What I know is on the public record. I know what I've done personally, and I haven't harassed anyone. I have challenged ministers. I've challenged the prime minister. I've challenged different. I've challenged Jagmeet Singh. I've done what maybe you could call street journalism, or you could call it activist journalism of challenging powerful people, mostly on support for genocide in Gaza in recent years, but also on Haiti, on the NATO proxy war, on Venezuela over the years. And yeah, I've gone to events and I've challenged ministers. I've disrupted ministers, even, or prime minister. Most of what I've done is asking questions, and my preferred method is asking the question and seeing and showing how these politicians either are unable or unwilling to respond to what are ultimately pretty straightforward questions that have major political implications that they don't want to deal with. So I haven't harassed anyone. Now Dalia Kurtz was able to get the Montreal police in February to charge me for harassment for responding to her racist pro-genocide tweets online, and they ultimately dropped those charges, and then they brought in charges of me harassing the Montreal police for having promoted a email campaign opposing them bringing these dubious charges against me for Dalia Kurtz. So the NDP could make a claim that I've been before the courts on these issues, but give us details at minimum. They don't want to give details because either they'll be laughed at for the absurdity of what they're, if they're supporting Dalia Kurtz, or if they're supporting, when Justin Trudeau it was in November of 2013, 6 weeks into the genocide, and he came out of that event. We almost got into the room where he was, and then he came out and we yelled at him as he ran to his big RCMP detail. Was that harassment? That was on the street. That was a politician on the street. Okay, me and 30 or 40 other people maybe did harass Justin Trudeau for supporting killing Palestinians. I don't know, that you can define it that way, but give us details, and they don't give us details. It's just a sort of character, a character assassination, or it's just mud.
Yeah. So let's just drill down a little bit into some of these details. So so people understand, Dalia Kurtz is a fanatical, racist, genocidal, Zionist influencer. The charges that she persuaded the Montreal police to bring against you were dropped, right? At the 11th hour, they weren't even pursued in a trial. You did actually get tried on the absurd claim that you harassed Montreal police, these tough guys at the Montreal police, because you asked your supporters to send emails to the officer who advised you of the arrest. But that verdict hasn't been rendered, right? You're waiting for a decision of the judge. It was a one-day trial, as I understand. Is that correct?
Yeah,
right.
In January 23rd.
Secondly, Yves, I've done a number of these interventions with you, where you have been pointedly asking tough questions to people who are powerful, and I know how you conduct yourself. You've never, in my experience or to my knowledge, ever assaulted or threatened to assault any of these people. Is that fair?
That is absolutely correct.
And finally, Yves, you have a practice of posting your videos of these interactions with these, people in positions of power who don't have any basic human decency. You post them on social media, right?
Yeah, so exactly. I would be incriminating myself if you want to look at it a legal standpoint. Yes, I post it all. It's all public. And
Okay, so anybody curious to see how Yves conducts himself in these interactions, you can find plenty of them on his X account. What's your X handle, Yves?
Engler Yves.
Okay. So if you're interested, I tell you, quite apart from whatever your views may be about this vetting process, I think that those are very informative and enlightening interactions that you've had over the years. So I do recommend that people take the time to look them up if they can. Now let's deal with the second point here, Yves. Promotion. One thing I want to say before I move on to the second point. When I was rejected as a leadership applicant and ultimately allowed an appeal, they used a similar argument against me, and they highlighted one particular interaction, which you and I had involving Erwin Kotler. We disrupted an event at which Erwin Kotler was treated lavishly as some kind of star of the political landscape here in Canada. Can you briefly describe what happened at that event, Yves? Maybe that's part of the reason why they're accusing you of harassment too.
Yeah, Globe journalist brought up Erwin Kotler to me yesterday. So now what we did was a few of us, remember myself and Malcolm Guy, we went, Kotler was speaking at Concordia University. We went on stage with placards. I believe the one I had was something about Canada, Venezuela. And Malcolm, I think, had something about Kotler's position on Palestine. And we made a statement. I think I spoke for maybe a minute or two, and then security asked us to leave. And if I remember correctly, as Malcolm and myself kind of left the venue, you stood up and you asked Kotler, you made a statement towards Kotler's support for Israel's apartheid and crimes against Palestinians. I think the whole thing probably lasted for maybe 10 minutes. So his speech was disrupted for between maybe 5 and 10 minutes. I don't think anyone got closer than, I don't know, maybe 10 feet or 15 feet from Kotler. Kotler was sitting in a chair. Didn't look intimidated. There was, I think there was security in the room, lots of people in the room. It was disruptive, but it was absolutely non-violent and entirely political. And it should happen to Erwin Kotler everywhere he goes.
Exactly. He likes to hold himself out as the most influential, unofficial advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. And after this event, and by the way, he had a grin on his face the whole time that we were disrupting him, as if he was intimidated. But nonetheless, afterwards, the clowns in Canada's Parliament actually gave Erwin Kotler a standing ovation and condemned us for having had the temerity to disrupt the speech of this genocide supporter. So let's move on then to the second ground here, Yves. You allegedly promoted authoritarian and anti-democratic narratives. So I want to go through this one by one, albeit briefly. So first, they say you engaged in Rwandan genocide denialist rhetoric. How do you respond to that?
I've never denied the Rwandan genocide. I have repeatedly, including in my book, Canada and Africa, 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation, I've repeatedly criticized the role of the Canadian government, people like Romeo Dallaire, in propping up this brutal dictator in Rwanda that has Paul Kagame, who has invaded Congo repeatedly for 30 years, has overthrew a government, instigated a 8-country war that led to millions of people being killed, and continue right till today. Kagame's forces are the M23 are occupying big chunks of eastern Congo and displaced hundreds and hundreds of thousands and caused all kinds of violence. So It's B'nai B'rith back in July came with that smear, and it's interesting they chose that. I think they chose to go that way versus the anti-Semitism smear because it's been losing a little bit of its currency on the left. So they tried this sort of novel, Yves a Rwanda genocide denier. And when we offered the NDP information in response, they didn't have anything to respond with.
So then they say that you echoed Russian state propaganda with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war and NATO. And of course, Yves, you have been, as have I, an outspoken critic of the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. What is the essence of your critique of that war, and how do you respond to the claim that you've been echoing state propaganda of Russia?
Yeah, well, the essence of my critique, I've been critical of the Russian government's invasion. I have stated that dozens of times in articles and public interviews, but I have also, and I think most importantly for someone in Canada, I've detailed how Canada has played a role in provoking the war. Canada played an important role in the ouster of Yanukovych in 2014, not just in supporting the Maidan protest, but significant support, including the Canadian embassy being a base of support for over a week for Maidan protesters, including the far-right C14, in their bid to oust the government, in part because that government was pushing for neutrality, not wanting to join NATO. So I've written extensively about Canada's role in promoting NATO expansion, Canada's belligerent policy towards Russia. And this isn't just recent. You go back to World War I, occupying parts of Russia, you go back to the Crimean War, Canada fighting Russia. So there's a 150-year plus history of Canada viewing Russia as a geopolitical competitor, mostly of the British and the US empires. And so I've written that. The position that I've taken, actually, Jean Chrétien in June came out on the sidelines of the G8, and he said that NATO expansion was a central issue, that he had long discussion with Vladimir Putin. NATO expansion was a central issue to understand what's going on. So if I'm echoing Russian propaganda points, so is our former Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien. So, obviously, NATO is not a defensive arrangement. Our platform calls for Canada out of NATO. That was the position of the NDP for 20 plus years. Never was rescinded. Members voted for Canada out of NATO position. This is it's not just an acceptable position. It's the right position. With this huge military spending increase, this is because NATO is pushing for it, or Donald Trump pushing NATO to massively increase military spending. So I have no doubt that the position I've been articulating on Canada's role in the NATO proxy war, that history will bear it out as the morally correct position, and trying to expel me from participating in the race because the NDP has been a staunch proponent of NATO proxy war. And Heather McPherson's on the NATO Parliamentary Association. She's one of the candidates. They stood up and applauded for someone who fought for the Nazis, Yaroslav Hunka, in the House of Parliament, House of Commons. So the notion that they're kicking me out of the race because I challenge NATO, and then someone in the race is on this militarist bodies promotion organization in this country and stood up for a former Nazi soldier. It just tells you how power works in the NDP and in Canadian politics more generally.
And just to be clear, although the get out of NATO policy approved decades ago remains on the books of the NDP, would you agree with me that no sitting member of the NDP actually advocates for Canada to get out of NATO despite that policy?
Yeah, and in fact, they advocate for NATO. They might not always come out. Well, Heather McPherson directly does by being on the NATO Parliamentary Association, but they have been staunch proponents of the NATO proxy war, and so yes, this is a position, I think, but I think there's actually still a surprising number of NDP members that are quite sympathetic to the Canada to NATO position.
Right. Now, the third thing they allege is that you suggested sympathy. They say suggested comments suggesting sympathy for the regime of former Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. How do you respond to that, Yves?
Well, the evidence they provided was a 30-minute or so interview I did with Ken Stone, who is an activist, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, and the interview was focused almost entirely on Canada's role in this Western effort to oust Assad. But within that, Ken Stone gives his perspective on the Assad government. And I stop him amidst this interview and I say, I use the word, many would take umbrage with your depiction of the democratic credentials of the Assad government. And then I say it's a father to son 50-year rule. So this is like in the interview. I mean, I'm very clearly, I challenge the person I'm interviewing, who I think, quite frankly, his position on Canada's role in Syria is very much the right position, and he's done very good, did very good research and stuff on that element. I don't agree with his position on the specifics of the Syrian government, then Syrian government, or then overthrown Syrian government. But so to me this is just sloppy. I mean, they were just looking for everything, and they wanted to get Rwanda, they want to get Syria, they want to get Russia, they wanted to get anti-Semitism, they want to just harassment, they want to just get everything in there, and it was a pretty sloppy exercise to provide. The evidence was an interview where I actually state my doubt about Assad's rule.
Yeah. And let's be frank here. I mean, you'd have to be an intellectual toddler to believe that Canada supported the overthrow of Assad because it cares about human rights and international law. If that were the case, it would have blackballed the Israeli apartheid regime decades ago. And finally, Yves, they say here that you repeatedly called to abolish Canada's list of terrorist organizations, which would remove a key national condemnation of groups that have violated international human rights law. How do you respond to that, Yves?
Yeah, well, the U.S. government, the Israeli government aren't on Canada's terrorist list. So if you want to deal with the major, human rights violators in the world, Canada's terrorism list it doesn't deal with doesn't have the Israeli military on it, doesn't have the U.S. military, or the British military, or for that matter, the Canadian. So this is it's kind of a bizarre one also, because my position is been a position that the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, which is a collection of dozens of civil society Canadian groups, including the Canadian Labour Congress, including Amnesty, including the Steelworkers, Unifor, major Canadian unions who are close with the NDP. Well, it was a CLC, Canadian Labour Congress officer that was involved in this decision. The review, or we think, at least we're not sure, but and the CLC, is part of this coalition, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, that's calling for the abolition of the terrorism list. So I don't know. I mean, it's true that I have called for that, and we've put it forward in our platform, and we put it forward from the Palestine element, in that it's a very anti-Palestinian. The terrorism list is a threat to Canadian civil liberties. It's a geopolitical tool, but it's also, specifically anti-Palestinian. That's the angle that we've kind of honed in on the terrorism list. But that position is not, is not actually that marginal of a position. And so, and to use that as an argument for the fact that I can't be part of the race, I mean, it's a bizarre argument. And again, when we point this out to them, they don't respond with anything.
Right. And it bears pointing out, I'm sure you'll agree, that even if they abolish this list and the whole legal regime surrounding terrorism, there would still be powerful weapons available to law enforcement authorities to deter and punish terrorism, like, laws against assaulting people, threatening people, killing people, conspiring to do all of those things. There are severe penalties attached to them under Canada's criminal code. So, it's not like the government would be powerless to deal with these types of crimes if we got rid of this hypocritical and highly politicized terrorist list. Is that fair, Yves?
That's fair. What made it a bit more difficult for them to do is to criminalize a grassroots solidarity organization like the Samidoun Palestinian Political Prisoners Network, Vancouver group, that was put on the terrorism list in October of last year, basically because they were organizing demonstrations against Canada's complicity in Israel's genocide. So it's a anti-Palestinian list. It's part of the geopolitical, but it's also a huge threat to Canadian civil liberties. But yeah, the law enforcement agencies have many other tools, and the court system has many other tools to target, those who are, threatening or hurting or whatever.
Yeah, another example, in addition to Samidoun, of course, would be Palestine Action in the United Kingdom, although they've not yet been targeted here. They're literally throwing, elderly people, blind people, disabled people who've come out to show solidarity in the streets peacefully with Palestine Action. The British government's throwing them in jail. I mean, this is how outrageous this whole terrorist designation regime is in the West. So let's turn to the third and fourth reasons they gave you for rejecting your candidacy. I'm going to deal with these briefly in the interest of time. They alleged that you made comments reflecting or manifesting an anti-Semitic attitude. What do you say in response to this allegation, Yves? And specifically, please talk to us about the support you received from members of the Jewish community in responding to this allegation.
Yeah, well, we just did a press conference with Rabbi David Mevisser was one of the speakers, and he was one of the instigators and promoters of this public letter signed by 100 members of Canada's Jewish community, explicitly telling the NDP not to use Judaism or the Jewish community as a rationale to block members from being able to choose me in the leadership race. So I categorically reject the smear, the allegations. I have been a staunch opponent of Canada's support for apartheid and genocide for more than 20 years. And I've been a aggressive challenger of the pro-Zionist Jewish organizations that have justified these crimes, promoted these crimes, and have used the history, the Nazi Holocaust to enable and justify the horrors Israel's befalling on Palestinians. So I don't back away from anything I've written, and I'm a very clear and proud to have been a leading challenger of groups like the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, B'nai B'rith, for their genocide apologia, or even worse. So it's this is not new. I was at the Concordia Student Union 23 years ago when Benjamin Netanyahu tried to speak, and he was protested, and the student union and the protesters were accused of anti-Semitism. This is waged against anybody who stands up to the genocide lobby and stands up for basic human rights for Palestinians.
Yeah, and I have no doubt Heather McPherson, one of these candidates, I mean, I can't give you examples as I sit here now, but I have no doubt that after she finally and belatedly started, condemning Israel for its genocidal rampage against the Palestinian people, that she herself has probably been called anti-Semitic on social media many times by supporters of Israel. But apparently that didn't bother the vetting committee, because she was allowed into the race. Any NDPer who has any kind of a public profile and has condemned Israel has faced allegations of anti-Semitism from people in the Zionist lobby. That's just a fact about Canadian politics. So then the final reason they gave you, this, I almost laughed when I read this, an unclear commitment to the NDP. They allege, this is the fourth and final reason they gave for rejecting your application. And they specifically claim that you expressed an intention to run for the Green Party of Canada while in the midst of your NDP leadership campaign. What's the scoop there, Yves?
I mean, this is just embarrassing, honestly. Like, this is just shows you that they were just trying to find every bit of mud and they were just going to throw it down. And they literally cite a blue sky impersonation account that we have publicly condemned. We've asked to have shut down, that says that it looks like me, it's Yves Engler, and says that I'm running to lead the Green Party. The one or two posts before that one, it's some bizarre post about like Zionist cars all around Montreal following me. It's very obviously not my account. It's very obviously just a kind of, I don't know who's doing it, what their motivation is exactly. It would take about a minute and a half of looking at the account for that to be pretty clear. And they put this in evidence to say that NDP members are not allowed to have the right to vote for me based upon this obvious absurd impersonation account. And then again, when we detail this, crickets. There's no response.
Right. We'll get back to that in a second. So that's it. Those are the reasons. So before I move to what happened next, I just want to point out that at the end of this communication from the vetting committee, where they laid out these 4 reasons, they responded to a request that I had made on your behalf to disclose the identities of the members of the vetting committee and to provide copies of documents on which they relied in making this decision. And here is what they had to say. We acknowledge that you have requested the names of members of the Leadership Vote Committee and the names of all witnesses or other individuals whom the committee consulted for the purpose of making this decision. The rules do not provide a basis for this request, and we respectfully decline to provide this information. Now, notice there, they don't say that the rules prohibit us from honoring this request. They say they don't provide a basis for it. In fact, there's nothing in the rules which would prevent them from making this disclosure and enabling you to respond more effectively to these allegations. And then they also say, we also acknowledge that you have asked for all documents, including electronic records, that the committee reviewed for the purpose of making the decision. In this letter, the committee has provided hyperlinks to the records, which, along with the reasons, are sufficient to understand the committee's decision. Of course, the hyperlinks they're talking about are hyperlinks to things you said, and not to things that others said about you. And then they say no broader disclosure is required, especially where others' privacy and safety interests may be engaged. They omit to mention that if they really cared about the privacy of people who made these complaints, they could just redact out their names and identifying information so that you could at least see the substance of the allegations they were making against you. In any event, let's move on then. So we filed, on behalf of Yves' campaign, a detailed response to these 4 allegations or 4 core allegations, along with the supporting letter from members of the Jewish community. And several days later, we got the response of the Leadership Review Committee. And this is the initial response. And again, I'll read it for those who can't see the small script. Thank you for your submission and for taking the time to engage in the leadership review process. After careful consideration, the Leadership Review Committee has decided to uphold the original decision to reject your candidacy. In accordance with the leadership rules, the committee's decision is final and no further review will be considered. We appreciate your time and effort, blah, blah, blah. They do not disclose a single reason for rejecting Yves' appeal. They give absolutely no explanation. So I then wrote back to them and said, you have provided no explanation whatsoever, not even in summary form, of the Leadership Review Committee's decision to uphold the original decision. Is your email sent to me today at 15:51 all the explanation that Mr. Engler will receive from the review committee for upholding the original decision? And they wrote back hours later saying, thank you for your email. The Leadership Review Committee is responsible for considering any request for review from rejected applicants. We have completed this work and communicated the outcome of our decision in accordance with the rules of the leadership race. So again, there's nothing in the leadership rules, I can assure you, which would prohibit them from explaining to you in detail, Yves, why they rejected your appeal. What do you think is going on here? Why are they refusing to tell you anything about the basis for rejecting your appeal?
Well, the first thing I want to say is this: they're framing this in the press now as this independent review committee had looked at it, right? So they're framing it as this very, outside of the NDP structure. My guess is that they understand that first of all, they have no substance to respond to what we gave to them in response to their allegations, and that they got some sort of legal advice suggesting, just saying it might look bad from a public relations standpoint to not offer any rebuttal or any further information, but it's best from a legal standpoint to do that. That's my guess, but I don't really know. I think they had made this decision, months ago before we submitted, obviously, and that they didn't want me part of this race, and I think that they also have been, I think, a little bit scared by how much support we've generated. They know that we're not just, if they let us in this race, we're not just going to be, like get number in a sixth place with 3% of the vote or something like that. That we will get a significant share of the vote. I think it would be difficult to win, but I don't think it was even impossible to win on the first ballot. I think that actually was possible to get more first ballot votes than any other candidate. But yeah, I can only presume what motivated, but they clearly didn't want us part of this race. And now we're asking the federal council to overturn this decision. It's a difficult one. He needs 2/3 of the federal council, but it's a very bad look for the NDP to make this decision, and not just to exclude, but then to do it in such a manner where you're literally like citing blue sky impersonation accounts to make the decision.
And lastly, before I let you go, where do you go from here? What is your campaign now going to do with this rejection, given that there's no further appeal possible?
Well, we are asking the federal council to overturn it. They can do that. It needs 2/3 vote. But we are doing a tour, irrespective, beginning latter part of January, that highlights the lack of democracy in the party. We are going to go to the convention. We are going to be protesting NDP events in the coming months, all the way up until the convention. We are calling on the other candidates to pause their campaigning and to basically say that this is a rigged election. You shouldn't want to win this because a significant candidate was excluded in this very dubious way. This is not just an attack against me. This is an attack against activism. At the crux of what they're saying in their complaint or in their justification is that we haven't just followed, or I haven't just followed sort of like polite liberal activist norms. And I've gone up to politicians and actually asked them questions directly. And yes, I don't sugarcoat my criticism of Canadian imperialism. That's in large part what they're saying, is that this is activism that's a little too bold, a little too hard line, and we don't want it part of the leadership race. And so it's an attack on activism. I think it really is an attack on activism, specifically on the foreign policy front, but an attack on activism more generally.
Well, Yves, we wish you the best in helping or in getting this decision overturned by federal council. Of course, I'll do, and Reason to Resist will do all we can to assist in that regard. And whatever happens, I personally think that Canadians owe you a debt of gratitude for putting forward this bold program and highlighting the appalling lack of democracy in a party that's supposed to be representative of the left in this country. So with that, Yves will be signing off. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we're coming to you from Montreal, Canada on December 10th, 2025.